Hello and welcome to the crash course for the Introduction to Psychology course at Coopersmith Career Consulting. We are going to, we've got a lot of psychology courses here at Coopersmith. We've got, I think, 6 of them all together, but this one is really an introduction. This one is really just going to give you the basics, really prepare you for a wide variety of different studies in psychology. There's a recommended textbook over here. I'm not really going to be focusing on that much when it comes to this particular study guide, when it comes to this particular video presentation. We, however, are going to go by chapters that are based on that textbook. Chapter 1 is generally thinking critically with psychological science. The first chapter doesn't have a lot to do with psychology specifically. However, it is going to be a lot of concepts that are going to be relevant to the issues that we're going to discuss later on in the course. The first is this dichotomy that has always existed in psychology, this nature versus nurture debate. The idea is what forms somebody's psychological makeup? What forms somebody's attitudes? Is it the family? Is it the DNA, the genes that the person was born with? If your parents are smart, maybe you'll be smart too. If your parents are tall, well, you'll be tall too. That's, is it based on your genetic makeup? That's nature. That's something that really an individual and a family can't really control. Then there's the other type, there's the other way of looking at it, called nurture. Nurture is your psychological makeup based on your experiences. That's the idea of nurture. We know, for example, just to take height. If a person is born and one parent is 6'6" and the other parent is 6'2", the child is probably going to be tall from a standpoint of nature. But on the other hand, if the child is malnourished and doesn't eat healthy, the child may be a little shorter because of the idea of nurture. In other words, there was something that happened in the child's life that just changed the natural course of development. Well, psychology is the same thing. A person's personality, a person being, very afraid, or a person being very confident, that the nature is something that's inherent in the person's born with. Then there's nurture, which is essentially something that occurs based on the experiences of the individual. So again, this is a controversy over the relative contributions that nature, which is like your genetic makeup, and experiences, which is nurture, make to the development of traits and behaviors. Today, the main belief is that behaviors arise from the interaction between the two. And again, it's not a debate in that one or the other is correct. They're both clearly correct to some extent. But the question is, A, to what extent? And B, are different aspects of psychology, change the calculus in terms of nature and nurture? Some aspects may be more nature-based, and some aspects may be more nurture-based. One way to approach an analysis of a psychological makeup of a person is the biopsychosocial approach. Interesting word. That biopsychosocial's got 3 elements, you might have noticed. There's bio, which is biology, namely nature, namely a person's genetic makeup, a person's DNA. There is psycho, which is based on a person's mind, what a person thinks. Then there is social, which is the 3rd element over here. Social is based on the person's interactions with other people. The biopsychosocial approach, which is really kind of a way of looking at the nature-nurture debate, or the nature-nurture dichotomy, is to look at all 3. Look at the biological factor, look at the psychological, or psycho factor, the thought process of the person, and the social approach. So these are different accounts of the same behavior that together gives us a more complex understanding. So the approach of this is to incorporate all 3 levels of analysis, and they all complement each other to give you a full picture. A psychologist might use a biopsychosocial approach to appreciate the difficulties of a person who has an eating disorder. Did the person's parent also have eating disorders, and could they have passed a genetic predisposition for eating disorders from a DNA perspective? Then you look at the way the person has the person's attitude toward various things, and then and then you look at, do other people in the same person's peer group also encourage or have eating disorders? That's looking at all 3 levels: the way the person thinks, the way the person was born, and the way the person interacts with his or her, the other people in his or her environment. Psychology, like all other sciences, the study of psychology, like all other sciences, is based on the scientific method. Now, the scientific method means essentially first having an idea and then testing that idea through experimentation to the point where you have something that's a little bit more confirmed. Really, the first step is the hypothesis. The hypothesis is a testable prediction, often implied by a different theory, but the idea is that hypothesis is kind of an educated guess, a stipulate, or something that you theorize that, or not really theorize, but something that you think that may be true. You have a theory that somebody's fear of heights is based on having one time been thrown off a bridge, or something to that effect. Then you test it, and if it tests up to the rigors of experimentation, it becomes a theory. A theory is an explanation using an integrated set of principles that organize observations and predict behaviors or events. I mean, that's a definition that kind of is tailored towards psychology, because you're talking about predicting behaviors. But if you see, for example, in 100 straight cases, or in most cases, that people live in areas that are very high off the ground, they're not afraid of heights, you can theorize, you can develop a theory once it's been tested by experimentation, that people who live in high places tend to get used to heights and therefore not be afraid of them. An operational definition is a statement of procedures used to define research variables. Research variables means things that you're testing. If you're testing the degree of phobias in people, or if you're testing the degree of mental illness in children who went through a particular event, determining how that will be tested is an operational definition. Now, in order to get something from a hypothesis to a theory, you have to establish it through experimentation. That's a method by which an investigator manipulates one or more factors to observe some behavior. The thing that you're testing is called the independent variable. For example, let's say you're testing the issue of whether children that are exposed, that are fed a lot of vegetables when they're babies, tend to be more skinny when they grow up. So the independent variable, the thing that you're testing, is how much vegetables you feed the children when they're young. The dependent variable, the effect that you're looking for or trying to test, is how skinny the children will be when they grow up. And experimentation is, of course, used to test a hypothesis and to clarify a cause and effect relationship. If you find a cause and effect, for example, if you find that 80% of children who were given a lot of vegetables are skinny, whereas only 50% of people who are not given a lot of vegetables are skinny, well, then maybe you can infer a cause and effect relationship. The cause in this case being the fed a lot of vegetables, and the effect being, being skinny. And psychology, like other sciences, requires measures in order to make a determination of what effects there are. And there are different averages that you need to be aware of. Just in general, there's another course called Research Methods in Psychology, which goes through all the math involved. This we're only going to be a tiny little bit of math, and really just going to tell you the measures, the averages. You have the mode. The mode is the average, meaning the result that appears the most. In a group of 7 individuals, you have a test mark of 95, 2 have 87, 1 receives a 79, the last receives a 99. The mode is a 95 because there were 2 95s and only 1 of everything else. Mode is just the most frequently occurring one. That's all a mode means. Then you have a mean. A mean is the arithmetic average. Arithmetic average means just you add them all up and divide by the total number of samples. If the temperatures were 45, 45, 52, 47, 48, 50, and 55, I'm recording this in February when the recent temperatures have been more like 0 and 5 and 10, so this sounds pretty nice. But anyway, to find the average, all you need to do is add them all up and divide by the total number of samples. In this case, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 samples. So add them all up, you get 342. Divide by 7, you get 48.9. That's the average temperature. There's a third one, by the way, which is not on the slide over here, but there's a third one called the median. The median is the middle one, the middle temperature. In this case, let's say 55 would be the highest, 52 would be the second highest, 50 would be the third highest, 48 would be the fourth highest, and these would be the three lowest, so 48 would be the median. Because if you lined them all up from highest to lowest, 48 would be the one in the middle. That's the median. And finally in this chapter, with regarding research methods, we have something to watch out for, and that is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is something that we all deal with in our daily lives when we're testing something or trying to figure out whether something is true. One thing we tend to do is we tend to assume things are true if they match our previous assumptions. If, for example, we think that people who eat a lot of candy are going to be fat, well then when we're testing this out, we have to watch to make sure that we don't let that get in the way of researching the numbers. What you really should do is come into it with a blank mind and a blank slate and see what the numbers tell you. On the other hand, you do have to watch out to make sure if you think something is true, then you might either consciously or subconsciously try to make the numbers fit into that. Example, principals are often principals meaning business owners in this case, are often overly confident in their own hiring ability. I'm sorry, in this case we are talking about school principals. So therefore they're more likely to monitor the success of teachers they hired and the achievement of those they rejected. So for example, if you hired some people and then you automatically assume that they're good because you think you're very good at hiring. If you hired somebody that's not good, you may tend to ignore that person's negative. You may turn to ignore that person's negatives. Whereas if somebody else hired that person, you may look into that person's negatives a little more. So one important aspect of researching anything, and including psychology, is that you want to try to make sure you look at it from an objective standpoint and not let something like confirmation bias make your results unreliable. Chapter 2 is about biology. Now, biology is, of course, really kind of a necessary prerequisite to understand psychology, because before you can understand how the mind works, you got to know, what the mind is made out of. And the mind, the purpose of the mind, and namely the brain, when we say the mind, we're talking about the brain in this context, we're talking about communication of the neural communication throughout the body. The brain is the central component, the main part of the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then you have the rest of the nerves that go throughout the body. And the rest of the nerves that go throughout the body are neurons. Neurons are nerve cells. We've got cells throughout our body, and a type of those cells are neurons. Neurons are the basic building block of the nervous system. The dendrites are the bushy part of the nerve that branches out to receive messages, and the axons are the extensions. Let me give you a drawing here. Okay, this is essentially what a neuron looks like. It looks kind of like a regular cell, except that it's more frazzly on the edges, if you will. This is the nucleus, although you can't see what this said. This says the nucleus. That's the green thing in the middle over there. Every cell's got a nucleus in the middle. And you've got the cell body, which is over here. Then you've got these frazzly things on the edges, if you will, the bushy parts of the nerve that extend out to receive messages. That's really the purpose of the neuron, is to accept neural impulses, messages from the rest of the body, which is why it's shaped so funny like this, because it gives it more surface area to accept messages from all over the place. And these things are called the dendrites. And then you have the axons, the extensions that go to other neurons or glands or muscles. In other words, the axons are the terminals, really, the ends of the neurons that kind of accept messages. If you look, the difference between a neuron and a regular cell is just that the neuron is specifically designed to be able to accept messages and pass messages on. And impulses, which are electrical messages that go from the brain and scattered throughout the body, is really the main purpose, or the main thing that the neuron passes along. So an electrical signal, namely an impulse, travels from the dendrites to the cell body, to the axon of a single neuron. Again, you can see over here, it accepts the message wherever it is, goes through the neuron, through the sheath, to the axons, and whatever else. Over here could be another neuron, over there could be a regular cell, whatever it's trying to pass along the signal to. You have different types of neurons. You've got sensory neurons, whose job is to accept information. You've got motor neurons, whose job is to effect something, to carry something out, to do something. Sensory neurons accept incoming messages. You feel pain in your wrist. That's the sensory neuron that felt the pain in the first place. The motor neuron, well, when you send a message back to your, when your brain sends a message back to your hand saying, get out of there, okay, it hurts, there's a fire there, it hurts. Well, now go back and get out of there. That's the motor neuron that does it. And in between those two, the ones that bring the messages back and forth are the interneurons. You can probably figure that out from the prefix inter. Inter means in between. Neurons within the brain and the spinal cord that communicate internally. Now, within the nervous system, you've got the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Essentially, it's not on the slide here, but the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and the rest of the nerves that scatter throughout the body is the peripheral nervous system. Here's a quick drawing of the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system would be the brain and the spinal cord, which is really the main conduit, as you can see, that all the impulses go down the brain or to and from the brain through the spinal cord. Then the rest of these nerves that go throughout the body, that would be the peripheral nervous system. Now, so within that concept also, you can divide the nervous system into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is the division of the autonomic nervous system, which is really just the part of the nervous system that controls involuntary activity. There are many different parts of the body that, there's the part of the nervous system that controls things like you moving your arm and walking and moving your leg, as opposed to the autonomic nervous system, which is the part that controls the automatic. Sounds pretty similar as well. That arouses the body, mobilizing its energy in stressful situations. That's the sympathetic nervous system. When you feel adrenaline, when you feel your head start to pound, your heart start to pound, you're waiting to be interviewed, you get nervous, increased energy flows all over the body. That's the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic is the opposite. The parasympathetic is the part of the autonomic nervous system that calms the body. And does the opposite effect. You tell yourself to calm down, you tell yourself to relax. And sympathetic makes you more nervous, the parasympathetic makes you less nervous. Of course, the entire nervous system is controlled by the brain. In the parts of the brain, you've got the brain stem, which is the lower part of the brain that leads to the spinal cord. You've got the thalamus, which is really the part that directs the endocrine system. Let's look at a little part of the brain over here. You got the brain stem, which is on the bottom over here, kind of connects the brain. You got the thalamus, which is over here, which controls the hypothalamus, which is the thing that really controls the endocrine system and controls what your body secretes. There's the reticular formation, which is also over here in the lower part of the brain. You've got the cerebellum, which is down here, back here. And the cerebellum, which is all you'll see, we'll discuss in a minute what this big part of the brain is. Now we're discussing these little parts over here, which are kind of secondary, especially when it comes to psychology. You got the cerebellum, which is the rear of the brain. The functions include coordinating balance and movement, things like that. If a person damages the cerebellum, might have difficulty playing soccer or even standing up. Really, anything that controls balance is really controlled by the cerebellum. Again, you have the hypothalamus, which is an element of the thalamus, which controls the secretions of the body. Those are all things that are secondary to psychology. The thing that's the main part of the brain when it comes to psychology is the cerebrum. The cerebrum, which is the big part of the brain, if you look at this whole thing over here, is the cerebrum. You've got the medulla down here somewhere, you've got the brainstem, the thalamus, that's all fine and good. But the big thing over here, where the thought occurs, that controls voluntary activity, that is the cerebrum. That is a fabric of interconnected neural cells and controls all of the body's information processing center. The frontal lobe, again, which you can imagine is the front part of the brain over here. This is the front of the person's head, somewhere around there, is involved in speaking, muscle movements, making plans, judgments. This is the part where all the thinking is done. When we talk about psychology, generally speaking, we're talking about processes that are done in the frontal lobes of the brain. Chapter 3 covers a very interesting element, and that is consciousness. Consciousness essentially is what we are aware of. Our subconscious is what we're maybe not quite so aware of. So this chapter has a couple of concepts that are relevant to I guess, the border between our awareness and our non-awareness. First issue is the issue of dreams. A dream, as you've probably had one or two in your life, is a sequence of images, emotions, and thoughts passing through your mind while you are sleeping. Typically, dreams occur during what is called REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. There are various stages of sleep, and when a person is deeply asleep, not usually you don't have a dream when you just nap off for a couple of minutes, but rapid eye movement sleep is when your eyes flutter a little bit. That's where it gets its name from. Signs of a rapid eye movement sleep is the heart rate of the person increases, breathing becomes more rapid, eyes move rapidly under closed eyelids, so you probably wouldn't notice it if you're just looking at the person sleeping. The eyes are kind of moved around a little bit. And that is, I guess, when the person is sleeping deeply enough for the subconscious to kind of take over a little bit, and you have a dream. We don't really know exactly what a dream is. We can have theories, and we can guess, and we can try to figure it out. Everybody probably has their own theory about what a dream is. But from a psychological standpoint, dreams are triggered by random bursts of neural activities, which may be a reason why they involved emotional reactions, surprising change in scenes. We get different types of scenery in our dreams. Very often our subconscious borrows scenes from that we've seen in person during the day, during our lifetimes in general. And these come when your heart rate is increasing, you're sleeping, but there's a lot of activity in your mind, and that's how these dreams come. A similar concept is the concept of disassociation. Disassociation is a split in consciousness, which allows some thoughts and behaviors to occur simultaneously with others. Things that normally go together, two types of actions, may be experienced in a different way when you're talking about a dissociative situation. Hypnosis, which is really where a suggestion is made. I don't know exactly how to do hypnosis. I know somebody who's licensed in hypnosis, but that's not the point. The point is hypnosis, which is where kind of, I guess, suggestions are made to the person's subconscious, can cause a disassociation, which is where a sense of being separated from your body and watching yourself with a sense of detachment. An example over here is when a hypnotized person lowers his arm into ice water and feels the ice water but doesn't experience the pain that would normally be associated with, with feeling very cold water. And sometimes I don't know if it's actual a real thing, but they call multiple personality disorder, when a person has multiple personalities, they call it dissociative identity disorder. Dissociation, again, means a split in consciousness. A complete split in consciousness, when you have two different personalities, would be dissociative identity, different identities of an individual. And the last thing in this chapter regarding consciousness is the effect of drugs on consciousness. There are many different types of drugs people can take, and they affect their mind in different ways. There are stimulants that increase the person's activity, and then there are depressants that decrease the person's activity, and there are lots of different types over here. Depressants, again, things that slow you down. Very often people take depressants in order to sleep, or in order to calm down, in order to relax. Alcohol, tranquilizers, opiates. There are stimulants, which makes your blood run faster and increases adrenaline. Sometimes people take these things in order to stimulate their ability to work. Nicotine, cocaine, caffeine is another example. That very often people don't take nicotine. Well, nicotine is in cigarettes. Cocaine is illegal, of course. Caffeine is a stimulant that many people take on purpose in order to stimulate their activity. There are hallucinogens. Hallucinogens are drugs that make you see or experience things that didn't actually happen. And marijuana would be an example. Other examples would be, I guess, methamphetamine would be another common example. Cocaine, which is a psychoactive drug, it offers a fast track from euphoria, which is very much heightened activity, to crash, which is a dramatic decrease in activity. Effects of cocaine decrease appetite, dilate pupils, increase pulse rate, feelings of self-confidence and euphoria, but unfortunately cocaine has very, very strong negative effects. Emotional disturbances, cardiac arrest, convulsions, other symptoms. People, especially if they take too much, can die from the overstimulant effect of cocaine. The next chapter is entitled Nature, Nurture, and Human Diversity. And really what this chapter primarily is about is this idea of collectivism versus individualism. Individualism means focusing on the needs, of course, of the individual, giving priority to one's own goals over group goals, and defining one's identity in terms of personal attributes rather than the attributes of an entire group. In American culture, and in generally probably Western society culture in general, we have a strong focus on I rather than we. 85% of people in a study have agreed that it's possible to be pretty much who you want to be. We don't focus as much on the building the business or building the society as much as we focus on ourselves. Other countries, for example, in Japan, they have a much more collectivist society where they'll put a much higher premium on what's good for society rather than what's necessarily only good for the individual. That's collectivism. Collectivism is giving priorities to the goals of the group and defining one's identity accordingly. Again, an example, a person is a secretary and comes from a culture which places emphasis on individual achievement, may find it surprising to visit other cultures where they respect individuals. They may respect older people just by virtue of the fact that they're older people. They may respect people, again, like Eastern countries like Japan, is just the example that I can think of, where people are trained to focus on the good of the general public rather than the individuals. Individualist cultures value independence. They promote personal ideas, strengths, goals. Collectivists value interdependence, dependence with each other. Obviously, it's not necessarily that one is good and one is bad. They both have advantages and disadvantages. Individualist societies, of course, tend to promote innovation. You probably have people that promote the most new products and the new ideas, patents, things like that. Whereas collectivist societies tend to be more efficient in producing things, maybe in terms of manufacturing, things that really depend on cooperation by large numbers of individuals. Here are some differences. Again, independent versus interdependent. Individualist society would try to discover and express your uniqueness, whereas collectivist might say the best thing to do is to fit in. The me versus the us. The individualism-based society or individual may try to change reality, where the collectivist might try to live with reality. Individualist is defined by individuals as opposed to collectivism defined by networks, groups of people. Individualism, confrontation is okay. Dispute, arguments are considered okay, whereas harmony is valued more in collectivist area. Obviously, we're not necessarily one or the other. We have elements of both, but again, certain societies tend to put a little bit more focus on one or the other. And finally, we have this idea of a social learning theory. This is the idea that our attitudes are based not only on what our inherent thought processes were, but also how we were brought up. And it's fairly obvious, but it's important to point that out. This is the theory that we learn social behavior by observing and then imitating and being rewarded and punished. That, of course, is an essential component of child rearing. Social learning theorists assume that children learn gender identity by observing or imitating others. For example, This is a very interesting example. Someone says to his crying son, "Big boys don't cry," whereas if a daughter is crying, you hug her. And so boys learn that they should be tougher and not worry about their emotions as much, and girls learn that it's okay to cry, and a hug helps. Now there may be some element of inherentness involved in those things as well. It's very possible that even if you didn't do anything, the girl would be more likely to show emotion and the boy would be less likely to show emotion. But it's also based on what we tell boys. We may see a boy playing with a doll and take the doll away and give him a car instead, whereas the girl thing with the car, we give the girl the doll. And that obviously, even though there may be some inherent distinctions as well, I'm sure there are some inherent distinctions as well, at least that's something that shouldn't be overlooked, that how we encourage children certainly is an element of how they learn their gender identities. Continuing with this introductory course, we cover a chapter that really is the focus of an entire course a little bit later on in our psychology offerings called Human Growth and Development. This chapter is called Developing Through the Lifespan, which is really basically growth and development. We're going to discuss a whole bunch of different concepts that are relevant to the development of a human being from a psychological perspective. First of all, let's start at the earliest time. Let's start at infancy and childhood. Everybody is born with, and doesn't really have to develop, things called reflexes. Reflexes are inborn and don't have to be learned. For example, when the doctor takes that little hammer and hits your knee and your leg pops up, that is a reflex. When you put your hand in a fire and you instinctively reach it back, that of course is a reflex. You don't have to learn that, you don't have to be taught that, you just do it automatically. Babies are born with reflexes, of course, that are for many different purposes, including getting food. The rooting reflex, similar to the sucking reflex, which is, then if you've known any brand newborn children, as soon as they come out of the womb, one thing they can do is they can look for food. They can suck. In the hospital, they put the hand in the baby's mouth, whatever it is, the baby sucks on it right away because that is a reflex. And of course, crying. This is the newborn talent of using the right sounds to motivate parents to end the noise and feed the baby. That may be a little bit of an overstatement, but essentially babies right away know how to cry when they are hungry, or know how to cry when they when they have other issues that they need taken care of as well. 3-year-olds, in an experiment, a very interesting experiment. This goes a little bit beyond, obviously, the level of, inborn reflexes. But this was an interesting experiment where you had 3-year-olds were shown a model of a room. They were shown like a picture or a physical three-dimensional model with a miniature dog stuffed behind a miniature couch. Then they were taken to a room with the couch, and they figured out to look behind the couch to find the stuffed dog. And that is an example of symbolic thinking or symbolic learning in schools and in general in teaching children. Symbolism is used a lot in order to make a person understand something that may not be obvious initially. Another difference between infancy and adulthood is compared with adults, compared to younger adults, older adults experience positive emotions with more intensity and negative emotions with more intensity. As people age, their emotional maturity develops and they experience maturity with a little bit more intensity. Let's take a look at stages of development. Obviously, also relevant to human growth and development is Piaget, a famous Swiss psychologist. This is named after Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist who lived not that long ago. I think his work was mainly done in the mid 1900s. Anyway, he defined the stages of cognitive development from birth to nearly 2 years of age, from 2 to 6 or 7, 7 to 12, and then 12 up to adulthood. The birth to nearly 2, in other words, the baby stage, you have the sensory motor. That is where the children are experiencing through their senses. They're not really thinking that much. They're mainly experiencing the world through looking, hearing, touching, grasping. The senses, the 5 senses, which are taste, touch, smell, hearing, and sight. There are some psychological development as well, even in such young children, such as object permanence, understanding that things are there to stay, and anxiety about things that are brand new for them. Then you have the pre-operational stage, young children, essentially 2 to about 6 or 7, representing things with words or images using intuitive rather than logical reasoning. Children that are 3, 4, 5, 6 years old are able to represent things. They know what things are called, but maybe they're not able to fully understand their origins, how they come about, etc. Again, in their developmental stage, they have pretend play, egocentrism, which is an idea of thinking that everything is about them. 3, 4, 5-year-old children pretty much think the whole world revolves around them. If you have children, you'll probably know that that's true, that even if the parents are doing something important, that doesn't bother the children, that doesn't prevent the children from bothering them, because children don't understand that there may be something that's more important than their particular bottle or their particular, whatever it is that they're doing. Then you get to the stage of the older children, concrete operational, where they're getting to the point of where they're really developing the ability to function as adults, thinking logically about events, grasping analogies, performing arithmetical operations. And again, here, this is the point where the children are really learning to understand the logic behind things that happen. And finally, you have the last stage, 12 through adulthood, the last stage of childhood, where children are finally able to engage in abstract reasoning. Formal operational, this is really the level of adults, using abstract logic, using things that don't, even if they don't see it in front of them, they can start to understand things, and the potential for more mature and even moral reasoning that has to do with what's right or wrong, not necessarily with what's good for the individual. At the youngest stage, we looked at this over here. Let's take a look at some of these things in a little bit more detail. Object permanence, which as you know was developed very, very early in life, means the awareness that things continue to exist even when it's not perceived. Now, when a very young infant, a few days old, when something leaves the room, as far as the infant's concerned, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Again, I don't remember what it was like, but I guess if you're a tiny little baby in the hospital and taken away from the mother, so I guess the infant may think that the mother doesn't exist anymore. Well, at some point, even in the first couple of years, the infant starts to realize that things do exist and can come back, even if they are not in the room right then. Then you have the concept of egocentrism, which remember was a feature of children up until 6 or 7 years old, is the difficulty of taking another point of view. Mistakenly believes that in this one example, 4-year-old mistakenly believes his father would like to receive a toy car as a birthday present because, he would like to receive a toy car as a birthday present. So he figures probably the same thing is true with everything. I mean, I experienced the same kind of thing with my kids who, when I go to the doctor, my children ask me if I go to the doctor, am I gonna want a sticker from the doctor? Because after if I'm a good boy and I don't complain during my appointment, am I going to get a sticker? And I say no, and they say, well, why not? And I say because I don't really want a sticker, and they just can't understand the concept. A 5-year-old isn't able to understand that he would want a sticker, but his father wouldn't want a sticker. It just is not able to really process that. I guess eventually they'll figure out why adults don't want stickers, but in the meantime, I guess they'll just have to wonder. Another example, when 2-year-old Danielle is asked to show Mommy your picture and holds up the picture right before her own eyes. If she could see something, well, then obviously the parent can see it as well. I distinctly remember being a little kid and closing my eyes and assuming that nobody else could see me. I remember one time, just a little anecdote, when I was probably, 3 or 4 years old, and lying there, and my grandmother was there, and I covered my own eyes and said, "Ha, you can't see me." Because I honestly figured, and I remember my grandmother trying to explain to me that just because I can't see her doesn't mean that she can't see me, but I don't think I really fully understood the concept until I was maybe a little bit older. When children at that age at least assume that whatever's happening through their eyes is happening through everybody else's eyes as well. Psychosocial development is a little more complex than cognitive development. Cognitive development was just the ability to do things. Psychosocial development is the development of one's skills in applying their own thoughts and applying the workings of their own mind to the rest of what the person sees in society. And so here, rather than just dividing things, from 0 to 2 and then up until 12 and then up until young adulthood. Here, when we talk about psychosocial development, we're talking about all the way through essentially the entire lifespan. These stages were developed also by an eminent psychologist who lived in the 1900s named Erik Erikson. He was German-born, but he did his work mainly in the United States. I think he did his work in Yale and University of California, Berkeley. Anyway, basically he was born in Germany, but he did his work in the United States. He was actually, I believe, half Jewish, and he ran to the United States to escape the Nazis. But anyway, that's another issue. The stage of psychosocial, remember we discussed earlier this biopsychosocial, where you had biological development, and then you had psychological, which is thinking, and then social, which having to do with your environment of other people. Well, cognitive was really the bio aspect, and now we're going to look at the psychosocial development, the development of a person's thoughts in relations to his or her peers. Infancy, up to 1 year, very, very little in the way of psychosocial development, but you can have the issue of trust. If the same person feeds the baby, well, then the baby comes to trust that individual. If this person gives the baby a shot, well, then probably the baby is probably not going to trust that individual. Anyway, toddlerhood, again, very young childrenhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy is that toddlers learn to try to do things for themselves, or they doubt their abilities. Obviously, you want toddlers to get a certain level of self-confidence. As they do different things, and they see what works for them and what doesn't, they gain a little bit of these decision-making power. These dichotomies, trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, these are all things that are based on the results of their little experimentation. Preschool, again, here we're talking about toddler-age children. Initiative versus guilt. They learn to initiate tasks and carry out plans, or they feel guilty about their efforts to be independent. In other words, this is when they start actually carrying out plans, to carrying out tasks, rather than just doing things on the spur of the moment. Then you have the elementary school age children, really 6 to 12, 6 to 13, something like that. Children learn the pleasure of applying themselves. And again, the dichotomy of the success or failure is based on competence versus inferiority. Children that get good grades may develop self-confidence. Children that get bad grades may not. Then you have the adolescent stage, essentially the teen years into young adulthood, identity versus role confusion. This is really the stage at which people develop their identity. People that are 15, 16, 17, even 18, 19 years old are really developing their identity in life, establishing who they are in general. And again, the dangerous dichotomy, identity versus role confusion. If the children are able to, or at this point young adults are able to establish their role in society and role in life, obviously that's the more positive result, and the alternative is confusion about what the person's role is going to be. This could be in terms of career, this could be in terms of relationships, this could be in terms of pretty much anything. Young adulthoods, 20s to 40s, again, they struggle to form close relationships. And intimacy, which is the positive, isolation, which is the negative, I guess. I mean, I guess there's no inherent reason why isolation should be negative, but generally speaking, we assume that people that have relationships, that's considered a positive thing. People that have no relationships and live as a hermit, that would be considered a negative thing. Middle adulthood is, again, people discover a sense of contributing to the world, hopefully, and the alternative is stagnation, which essentially means nothing's happening. And then finally, late adulthood, end-of-life issues. People reflect on their own life and may feel a sense of satisfaction in his or her life, or unfortunately despair or failure. Okay, so just to go over these again, infancy, the main issue is trust.
preschool, the main issue is learning to initiate, learning to do things, learning to make plans, learning to carry out plans. When you're talking about adolescence, the main issue becomes identity. The task of the adolescent, the task of the teenager, in other words, is solidify a sense of self, trying to make sure that he or she carves out a niche in the world. What am I going to be doing? Again, that could be in terms of career. That could be in terms of, how you react with your family, how you react with your friends, etc. An example, Eddie's so unsure about his occupational future that within a year out of school he's already tried 3 different jobs. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's part of the process by which people can find their way in life. Teenagers may change their mind 100 times in terms of what they want to do with their lives. Once they're in their low to mid 20s, very often people have a pretty good sense of what they want to do. Now, of course, you could change. You could have career changes. You could have social changes, whatever it is. But people have a pretty good idea with what they want to do with their lives. When people are 14, 15, 16, probably every 3 days, they're changing their ideas about what they want to do with their lives. Of course, it also depends on the individual. Another very important aspect of development is, of course, memory. Explicit memory means memory of facts. You remember that when you go outside in the winter and you don't have a coat on, you're cold. It may seem fairly obvious, but without that, we wouldn't remember to put on our coat when we go outside in February or January. Then you have effortful processing, which is memory encoding, that requires a conscious effort. So if you're taking a test, if you're taking this test, for example, and there are certain key concepts that you have trouble with, you may repeat them to yourself 5 times so that you remember them eventually. Then you have implicit memory. This is kind of subconscious memory. This is something that deep in your mind you may know, but you may not be able to express on a whim. For example, if Leia doesn't remember that she got sick after eating pizza on several occasions in early childhood, but whenever she smells pizza, she gets a little nauseous. Now, she may not be able to tell you that pizza makes her nauseous, or that pizza made her sick when she was a kid, but she does know that pizza makes her nauseous because her subconscious has this memory of being sick after smelling and eating pizza. That would be an example of an implicit or subconscious memory. Other aspects, again, these are all things that you could spend entire classes on. You could spend hours on each of these things, but these are all really kind of bullet points of this cognitive development, growth and development aspect. Parenting styles. Obviously, every parent has their own style in terms of dealing with their children, but there are a few basic overarching themes that you could apply to various parents. There are authoritarian parents who impose rules and expect obedience. On the other hand, there are permissive parents. And again, you can't neatly pigeonhole everybody into one particular category. You could be a little authoritarian, you could be authoritarian on some issues and permissive on others. You could be authoritarian in making sure that your children come home on time, but permissive in that you don't force your children to eat vegetables. I mean, it's just it could be different. Authoritative is kind of in between those two, which you're not quite authoritarian, but also not permissive. Authoritative means parents are both demanding, but also responsive to the needs of their children. An example here is when a child is throwing a tantrum when you're shopping. Well, not giving in to the tantrum, but on the other hand, rewarding not throwing the tantrum. For example, you get a candy if you don't throw the tantrum. If you do, you don't get the candy, and I'm going to ignore you. Not necessarily authoritarian, not necessarily that strict, but it's rewarding good behavior. Research indicates that children with the highest esteem have authoritative parents. Parents that aren't tyrants, parents that don't exact strict obedience to everything, but parents that make sure to toe the line, make sure to enforce the rules by rewarding good behavior if possible. Changes in life, of course, there are changes throughout a person's life, but some of the main ones, the tips of the person's chromosomes. Chromosomes are what makes up a person's DNA, which is the coding in each individual cell that tells the body what to do. And the chromosomes kind of get worn down a little bit with age in each individual cell, which could be worn out, and it could be increased by smoking, obesity, stress, things that are not good lifestyle habits. And these things could eventually cause, obviously, physical problems. Again, there's also emotional changes. Older adults experience positive emotions with more intensity and negative emotions with more intensity, which we discussed earlier. Again, as people get older, their emotional development and makeup is refined and grown and nurtured and gotten to the point where it's much more developed than the emotions of younger people. Chapter 6 is about sensation and perception, how we see things and how we interpret things. First thing, in terms of understanding how we see and interpret things, is distinguishing between those two concepts. Sensation, which is we sense something, and perception is really how we interpret it. Sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors, which is a fancy way of saying the things that we use to pick up external signals, and nervous system, of course, that could be your eyes, that could be your ears, that could be your nose, mouth, well, taste, feel, hear, sense, and smell and sight, whatever. Anyway, there are 5 of them. I think I might have repeated myself a couple of times. But anyway, the point is that is how we sense things. But then how we interpret the information is next, perception, the process of organizing and interpreting the sensory information. We could look outside and see snow all over the place, like I am right now, and it's cloudy out, and see the wind blowing, the leaves blowing on the trees, and and then I see that my thermometer says that it's 12 degrees, and I could interprets. That's my sensation. That's what I'm seeing. And then my perception is that it's cold outside, and that if I go outside, it's going to be cold and windy. And if I do go outside, I'd better get on a coat and gloves and earmuffs and whatever else is going to make me a little bit more comfortable. That's my perception. The main, well, I shouldn't say the main, but certainly one of the important aspects of which we sense things is through our eye. Light travels through the cornea, passes through the pupil and the lens, and enters the retina. Now that probably doesn't mean a whole lot outside of a diagram, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a diagram over here. This is a diagram of an eye. This is the front of the eye. This is the thing. This is your pupil. This is what gives you your eye color right over here. This is wherever the sensor is. It starts through the cornea, which is out here. And then it goes in through the pupil. This is the thing that's blue or brown or green or whatever it is. Goes through the lens, and then goes to the back of the eye. The most of the eye is made up of the retina. And the retina itself has layers that process visual stimulation. This is a diagram of the retina itself. And you can see that first the light passes through these rods and cones, which kind of, is a parallel. Well, the light comes from this direction and then goes straight to the back of the eye. In other words, the first thing it goes through the rods and cones, which are over here. These are things, I guess, that flatten out the light. It hits these bipolar cells, which are all the way in the back over here, and once the light hits these bipolar cells way back here, they activate the ganglion cells, which are over here in the front of the eye. When the light passed it for the first time, it didn't do anything, but now it activates them, and they form the optic nerve, which is the thing that actually senses the light. And then, of course, you can do with the light whatever you want to do with the information that you now have. Okay, let's take a look at a separate point, and this is about perception. Perception is based on, first what we experience. And the first thing, figure ground, is the organization of the visual field into objects that stand out from their surroundings. In other words, a statistician would tell you this is distinguishing the signal from the noise. The signal is what you want, and the noise is the background information. When we look at a scene, the first thing we do is we pick out, okay, what it is that we want to see. You might be looking at your friend talking to you, and the only thing you're looking at is, even though your field of vision's got the walls in the background, and it's got the telephone in the background, it's got, whatever it has, got windows, but the only thing you're looking at is your friend, because that's the only thing you're interested in interpreting right this minute. So an airplane, for example, descends for a landing. A pilot is landing in the Bahamas or whatever it is, may see many beautiful islands and ocean water or whatever it is, but that's just the background stuff. What the pilot wants to see is the ground and the runway. Obviously, if the pilot was sitting there being distracted and looking at all the beautiful palm trees and water, then pilots wouldn't do too well when they're landing on islands. When you attend a large party, the voice of the person you're listening to and is the signal, is what you're looking for, and the background is the ground. That's what you're not really listening to. It might help, in the background. It might be pleasant, whatever it is, that's fine. But that's not when you're talking to an individual in a crowded room, you're trying to focus on just what that individual is saying. That's the figure. The ground is the background. In terms of statistician, the person you're listening to is the static, is the signal, and the background is the noise. And finally, we have this concept of grouping. Grouping is the perceptual, means perception, tendency to organize stimuli. Stimuli are things that cause a reaction, something you see, something you hear, something you feel, whatever it is, into coherent groups. That could be based on proximity. We group nearby figures together. If four boys are standing together in a baseball dugout, we assume that they're on the same team. May not be true, but that may be the first thing that we look at. And that may be the first thing that we assume. Continuity. We perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. We try to look at, we may be able to fight this impulse, but the initial impulse is to make things consistent with each other. And finally, we fill gaps, to create a whole object. Even though one of the strings on a guitar was broken, the musician could mentally fill in the missing notes of familiar melodies. If something is missing, you may be able to, obviously it's not going to be there, but you can fill out in your mind what should be there. Chapter 7 is a fascinating chapter on learning and more specifically conditioning. Learning from a psychological perspective is similar conditioning in that learning is a method by which we establish what is, we tell our minds, we teach our minds what's going to be the reaction to certain types of behaviors. There are two basic types of conditionings that we're going to discover in this chapter, or learn about in this chapter, and that is operant and classical conditioning. Classical conditioning involves respondent behavior, reflexive behavior, automatic reactions, fear, craving. It's the idea of something that events teach you to inherently fear, or inherently like, or inherently desire, or inherently trust certain stimuli based on what's happened in the past with those things. The way this is done, essentially, is that the stimulus repeatedly precedes the behavior and eventually triggers that behavior. If every single time it starts to rain, your joints are going to start hurting, well, then you're going to start fearing the rain clouds. People have arthritis sometimes when there's moisture in the air, their joints hurt. Well, you're going to fear rain clouds, not because the rain clouds themselves are going to hurt you, but because the rain clouds are symbolic of moisture, which is going to hurt you. Then you have operant conditioning, which is a little bit more sophisticated. It involves operant behavior, which is chosen behaviors which operate on the environment. These behaviors become associated with consequences, with punish or reinforce the behavior. Something that is learned and a little bit more complex. First, we're going to discuss classical conditioning, which can be done on animals, could be done on children, could be done on babies. Then we're going to look at operant conditioning, which is really more about more advanced older children, adults, and essentially human beings. So again, classical conditioning is when learns to link two or more stimuli, two or more things that occur. Then an example, a person really likes ice cream, gets a craving for ice cream when passing the ice cream shop, because at some point in his or her life, going near an ice cream shop meant the ability to get ice cream. Operant conditioning is strengthened or followed by a reinforcer if it's strengthened, if followed by a reinforcer, and diminished if followed by a punishment. Children often learned to associate pushing a vending machine with delivery of the candy bar. or opening the refrigerator with, or opening the freezer with getting ice cream. Sometimes my kids will do that. You know, if they're hungry, the little kids, they go to the freezer and open the freezer. Now, obviously, the freezer itself has nothing to do with anything, but the child remembers that the last couple of times in the past when the freezer was opened, that meant ice cream was on its way. So why don't I go open the freezer and hope that ice cream's on its way this time too? Not inherently logical, but that's an example of conditioning. Here's an example of classical conditioning. After repeated exposure to two stimuli in a sequence, we associate this with each other, lightning and thunder. Since in the past, when we've seen lightning, we've then heard thunder a few seconds later. Thunder's a little bit, sound is a little bit slower than light. That's why during a thunderstorm, first you see the lightning, and then you hear the thunder. Actually, the closer the storm is to you, the more on top of each other the sounds are. If you hear the lightning and right away the thunder, it means the storm is right near you. If you hear the lightning and then have to wait several seconds, it means the storm is a little bit further away from you. But again, that's a different issue. But the two things are associated with each other, because in the past we have experienced both, one on top of another. These next few slides are about a famous experiment done by a psychologist named Pavlov. They still call something, if you react to something that is based on conditioning, they still call it a Pavlovian reaction. Essentially what he did is he took a dog, and every time the doorbell rang, he gave the dog food. And ring the doorbell, give the dog food. Ring the doorbell, give the dog food. Well, eventually, when he rang the doorbell, the dog started salivating because the dog expected to get food. Now, obviously, the doorbell has nothing to do with food in itself, but if you associate it enough with getting food, then the dog is conditioned to think that the doorbell's going to get him food. The opposite, same thing is true with the opposite. If every time the doorbell rings you hit the dog, well then when the doorbell rings, the dog gets scared, even though obviously the doorbell is not going to hurt the dog, but the dog learns to associate the doorbell ringing with getting hit. There's an example before conditioning. Well, when the doorbell rang, when the bell rang, the dog didn't react. It had no significance whatsoever. On the other hand, when you give the dog food, then the dog salivates. It's like people when you smell good food, pizza, ice cream, whatever, good steak, not together hopefully, but if you see them, then you salivate a little bit because you're now I'm thinking of a good slice of pizza, so I'm salivating a little bit because we associate food with, obviously our body salivates, which is a method by which our body expresses hunger. However, then, when the bell tone was repeated with the presence of food, the neutral stimulus was combined with the unconditioned stimulus, then the dog salivates, and eventually, you can even cut out the food, just the bell makes the dog salivate. The dog begins to salivate upon hearing the tone. So the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus has the same response. In other words, the doorbell and the food gives the dog the same response because the dog learns to associate, just like the dog already knew to associate food with eating. Well, now, because you've combined them so many times, you've done it 20 times, or you've done both at the same time, the dog learns to associate the doorbell with eating. And so the doorbell can make the dog salivate. Example of classical conditioning in people. A baby hears soft music and is given books while listening to the soft music, and therefore the baby learns to like books even without music, because if the baby likes the music and the book always came with the music, so the baby associates the book with the music. I mean, you see this all the time with people. People associate events. If they were going through a tough time in their lives, and while they were going through a tough time in their lives, it was fall outside and the leaves were yellow, then a person could learn to dislike yellow leaves, even though obviously the yellow leaves had nothing to do with the person's hardship in life. The person subconsciously associates what he or she saw during that time with whatever hardships were going on at that time. And conditioning also comes with generalization. Generalization could be a good thing, but it very often is a bad thing, where people learn to, kind of paint with a broad brush, where they see things that may not have anything to do with each other, but they associate them with each other. Um, for example, when toddlers are taught to fear moving cars and motorcycles, they also became of moving trucks and buses. Again, that could be a good thing. That a parent says, don't run out in the street when the car coming, and the parent gets very upset when the child runs toward the street. Well, the child learns to fear anything that's moving. In that case, it could be a good thing. On the other hand, if a child could develop a fear of small white rodents because the person was attacked by a rat or whatever it is, then a child could become afraid of other animals that, cats or dogs or rabbits or whatever it is, but that are similar. A child could learn to fear those as well. That's true in general. People that have bad experiences, especially younger people that have bad experiences, could learn to associate everything that looks like or feels like or smells like those experiences with the negative attitudes. The opposite of generalization, or the converse of generalization, is discrimination. This is where we learn to distinguish between conditioned stimuli and stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. For example, if the dog were a human being, in the Pavlov example, which it's not, but okay, well then the dog would eventually figure out that even though several times there was a ring of a bell followed by giving food, the bell doesn't really have anything specifically to do with the food, and the human being would be able to differentiate the signal from the noise, would be able to, in scientific terms they call that distinguishing correlation from causation. Just because something happens after something else doesn't mean it was caused by it. Just because you got sick after you went outside in the cold weather doesn't necessarily mean that the sickness was caused by your going outside in the cold weather. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation. So, for example, Jody's heart races when she sees a bear, but hardly ever races when she sees the neighbor's rabbit. Even though they're both animals, maybe a baby or maybe an animal wouldn't be able to distinguish the two, but she is able to distinguish the two. Security dog may make a person's heart race, but not when he sees the neighbor's seeing eye dog, even though they are both dogs. Operant condition is the latter part. Until now, we've been discussing classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is conditioning that is taught by reward or punishment. A child associates response with consequences, behavior with consequences. For example, saying please may actually get you what you want. Something else, on the other hand, being taught that saying gimme, gimme may actually follow undesirable results. So, getting a reward strengthens the behavior, whereas getting punished inhibits the behavior. Operant conditioning works with humans, but it also works with animals by punishing bad behavior or behavior that you don't want and rewarding behavior that you do want. We may smile more at work if we get bigger tips. If you're a waiter or a waitress, whatever it is, and the more you smile, the better tips you get. Well, that's operant conditioning. That's essentially rewarding behavior, encouraging future behavior. We learn how to ride a bike using strategies that don't make us crash. I mean, just a quick story. The first time I ever rode my bike, not the first time I ever rode a bike, but when I was, thinking when I was probably 20-something years old, I decided I was going to go out and ride a bike, and I was going to ride it every Sunday, whatever it is. First time I ever tried, I was riding my bike, and I wanted to get up onto a sidewalk, and I saw a little curb, and I figured I could take the curb. And so I tried to jump onto the curb, and I didn't, and the bike stopped, and I went flying, and I ended up cutting myself and injuring myself. I was okay, but it wasn't so pleasant. And so from then on, I realized to be more respectful of the curbs and not to try to take them at sharper angles or actually stop and put the bike up on the curb rather than trying to jump the curb like I did that first time. When you get burnt doing something, you stop doing it. You do something different. When you get rewarded doing something, you keep doing it. So an active chosen behavior, which is known as a response, is followed by a reward or punishment from the environment. Reinforced behavior, in other words, rewarded behavior, is more likely to be tried again, whereas punished behavior is less likely to be chosen in the future. We've got positive reinforcement, again, same basic idea. Increasing behaviors by positive reinforcers, and negative reinforcers are punishments to try to stop the behavior for whatever reason. And a negative reinforcement doesn't necessarily have to be an externally imposed punishment. It could just be something that you don't want to stop doing the behavior because that leads to a negative consequence. Running on a treadmill every day is maintained by a negative reinforcer, by the idea that if you stop running on the treadmill, you're going to gain weight or you're going to be less healthy, whatever it is. There are different types of reinforcers. There are primary reinforcers that satisfy a need or innately, in other words, inherently reinforce it. For example, a taste of food when you're hungry, or relief from a headache. That would be taking, the reinforcer to take an aspirin, or the reinforcer to eat would be relief from hunger. A conditioned reinforcer, or a secondary reinforcer, again, is something that is gained not directly, but is associated with the primary reinforcer. Maybe you know, for example, that eating bread is going to satisfy your hunger more than drinking water. Something that is conditioned. Even though it's not as direct, you know from past experience what's going to get you better results and what's going to get you worse results. The next element of Introduction to Psychology is that of memory. Memory is, of course, a key element when we're talking about our psychological behavior and our thinking in general. And memory is based on thinking and storing memories. The memories are not actually physical items. Memories in your brain, you've got all this white matter and gray matter, different parts of the brain. And within those cells, you've got impulses, which are essentially electrical impulses that are bouncing back and forth, and that's your thought. And you've got lots and lots of those because all your memories are essentially impulses that are bouncing around your brain. Eventually you forget some of them, that's fine, but everybody forgets things from time to time. Okay. Acquiring memories is the process of encoding, the processing of information into the memory system. Encoding when you generate a memory and the memory sticks in your brain. Then you have storage. That is the retention of memories, which keeps the encoded information over time. And finally, when you need the information, you go ahead and try to retrieve it. When you're taking a test, you retrieve the information that you need. When Carolyn meets a friend from 20 years ago, she needs to retrieve the name. Even though she hasn't seen the friend in 20 years, she may then be able to go back into the past and retrieve the information that's still there to try to remember the person's name. Improving memory. How do you improve? Well, memory is what it is. I don't know if you can necessarily improve your memory per se, but you can help the way you remember things. And some of these can actually help when you're taking tests, for example. Ways to save studying time and build more reliable memory. These are just some examples of the ways in which you're not really improving your memory. Your memory is what it is, but you're using techniques in order to help retrieval processes and help storage processes. You can learn the material in more than one way by creating retrieval cues, which means rather than just learning that the capital of New York is Albany, you can, for example, learn that Albany is a city on the Hudson River, and the Hudson River goes from New York City to the capital of New York. Again, I'm just giving you an example offhand, but the more ways in which you know something, the more chances you have to retrieve it. You can create mnemonics, which are songs, images, lists in your mind, poems, something like in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Of course, you have to remember the whole thing. You can't, for example, think that instead it goes in 1493 Columbus sailed the bright blue sea. I mean, you have to remember the rhyme, but there are also alliterations, or also, well, not alliterations, but things that's where you could remember words that stand for things. Sometimes where you remember a word and the word stands for each letter of the word stands for something. These are memory devices. Minimize interference with related materials, like sleep the night before, study right before sleep or other mindless activities so that you don't engage in other activities that cause you to forget what you just learned. Have multiple study sessions spaced further and further apart so that you give your mind more opportunity to retain the information. Activate retrieval cues. When you spend your study sessions, when you're studying something, close your eyes and try to remember it, or turn over the paper and try to remember what the paper said. Give yourself tests, many different types of tests, and that's testing yourself. Another thing you can do, or you can do subconsciously, you can do it intentionally or unintentionally, is priming. Priming is the activation, often unconsciously, of certain associations that predisposes memory, perception, or response. What this means is you associate in your mind, or you expect something that's coming next. You see a wind, so you walk outside and you expect to feel the wind against your skin. That's priming. You've primed yourself to expect something. The classic example here, the people use that as kind of a joke. If you've never had this done on you, I'll try it now. If I say spell spot 10 times fast, and you say S-P-O-T, 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 and you're thinking spot, 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 or say spot 10 times fast, and you're saying spot, 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 then I quickly say, what do you do when you get to a green light? And then, if you're thinking about it for too long, you say, go. But if you're thinking about it very, very quickly, well, you've just had spot, 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 so you're conditioning your mind to think in words that sound like spot, and so therefore you say stop. Sometimes that works on people, sometimes it doesn't work on people. What I've found is that it doesn't work on people who are more intuitive, people who like to think before they speak. Will think about it for a second or two and then say go. And then the invitation. It's like, for example, if I say roast 10 times fast, roast, 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 and I say, what do you put in a toaster? And then the idea is you say toast, which of course is wrong because you put bread in the toaster, and then it becomes toast. Anyway, that's an example of priming. And finally, we've got context-dependent memory. Context-dependent memory is putting yourself back in the context with your memory where when you experience something can prime your memory retrieval. This happens often where eyewitnesses to a crime scene that can't remember details of the car that went by, of the person that went by, whatever it is, the police may take the person down to the crime scene to look around, and maybe that'll jog the person's memory a little bit. Or, in this last example, which we've all probably experienced a couple of times, you need to sharpen your pencil, you go into the other room, you forgot why you went to the other room. What am I doing here? Then you go back and you sit down with your report and you say, oh, right, it was the pencil. Something like that. You go, I'm thirsty, I want a cup of coffee, so I go into the kitchen, get it. But when I get it, I'm thinking about other things. I'm thinking about work. I'm thinking about whatever. I get to the kitchen. I think to myself, what am I here for again? What did I want? Did I want a burger? Did I want a steak? What did I want? And whatever. And then I go back, sit at my desk, and say, oh, that's right. I wanted the coffee. That's an example of context-dependent memory, where you're depending on the context to jog your memory for what it is that you wanted in the first place. The next chapter, Thinking and Language, is about cognitive psychology. In other words, generating the ability to learn, generating the ability to use your mind. Cognitive psychology is the area of psychology that focuses on mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, communicating, in other words, everything that has to do with psychology. And this is going to be focused on increasing people's ability to learn, increasing people's ability to cope with what is necessary from a psychological standpoint. 4 strategies of problem solving are trial and error. This is where you do something and keep doing it until you get it right. You don't know which door to go through, you open them all and see which one works best. You don't know how to melt a particular ice, you try different liquids, you try different brands, you're not sure how to get the meatloaf to turn out properly, and so you try different brands of tomato sauce, different brands of ketchup until you find the one that comes out correct. Trial and error. If you have time and you have the resources, trial and error can be a fantastic way of doing things because you get to try everything until one actually works. Algorithm is a step-by-step procedure that guarantees a solution. It's not always possible because not everything has a mathematical solution, but an algorithm is essentially writing a mathematical formula. It doesn't necessarily have to be written in numbers to be called an algorithm, but most algorithms are in numbers. Essentially, it means finding the perfect solution by proving that it's correct by objective mathematical truths. Again, not always possible. Then you've got the heuristic method. Heuristic, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, means an approach to problem solving that employs practical methodology that enables the person to discover or learn something for themselves. It allows us to make judgments that solve problems more efficiently. In other words, we're not proving it as in an algorithm. We're not guessing as in trial and error, but we're trying to discover things for ourselves by thinking about them and thinking about how our experiences and our knowledge and our learning combine to allow something to postulate on what the best way of doing something would be. And finally, we've got insight. Insight is trying to understand the true nature of something by thinking about it and coming up with a solution that way. Let's take a look at some of the development of cognitive psychology. 0 to 4 months, essentially, this is really all in the process of a very, very young baby. In the first 4 months, the infant doesn't speak, it doesn't really communicate much. Still, there's some receptive language, associating sounds with facial movements, recognizing when sounds are broken into words. The baby doesn't necessarily understand words, certainly doesn't communicate in words, but at least the baby can start to associate facial movements. The baby can associate when when a parent is going to feed her and when a parent is going to change her, etc. On the other hand, 4 months to 10 months, all of a sudden you start to have the productive language. Productive doesn't necessarily mean that the baby can talk, but productive means the baby starts to make sounds, other than just crying. Crying is instant from birth, but productive language, maybe the baby starts babbling, maybe the baby starts moving his or her hand, maybe waving, maybe grabbing, whatever it is. These are things where the baby can communicate in language that's considered productive. Then all of a sudden at 10 months you start talking about babbling, still babbling stage, but the babbling starts to become a little bit more like words. And then finally at 12 months, one word, the baby can very often say one word like mom and hi and yes. That's pretty much it. Then you start to have some phrasing, seabird, rebook, go park, at 18 to 24 months, and then afterwards the baby starts to actually talk, although obviously it continues as you move along from age to age. In terms of thinking in language, in terms of cognitive psychology in general, very often the first thing to look at is how the issue is posed. And how the issue is posed is called framing. How an issue is framed very often affects judgments and decisions. The dangers of driving while texting is more alarming when it's presented in terms of number of people killed than in percentage of people killed. If I say, 1.8% of drivers who were texting and driving got into an accident, that means one thing. On the other hand, if I say, 22,000 people in the city of New York got into texting and driving accidents last year, and again, I don't know whether those numbers are true or not, I just made them up on the spot. You know what they say, 93.6% of all statistics are made up on the spot. But anyway, you can frame it rather than saying, for example, somebody got into an accident while texting and driving. You can say somebody's body got mangled and blood was squirting all over the place and needed a 12-day hospital stay and suffered brain damage. You're saying the same thing, or at least you're reporting on the same facts, but there are two different ways of saying that. Newspapers, for example, will try, and weather channels, whatever it is, will try to report things in a more sensationalist way to get people to react to them. They frame the stories. They may be saying the same story, but they're framing it in a very different way. The brain, of course, also affects language, also affects how a person speaks. And therefore, damage to the brain can cause impairment of language. Damage to the part of the brain that deals with language is called aphasia. Aphasia is caused by damage to the left hemisphere of the brain, either in the Broca's area or in the Wernicke's area. Just if you look at a diagram of the brain here, this is the cells in the brain, of course, and this just happens to be the Broca's area. And the Wernicke's area is actually in a little different part of the brain. Oh, there it is. Okay. So again, there's no inherent reason why this would mean anything to you. It's just different parts of the brain. You can see they're on the left hemisphere. You can't really see they're on the left hemisphere, but imagine you're facing to the left now. So this is the left area of the brain. You got the Broca's area, and you got the Wernicke's area, whatever it is. Again, I might not even be pronouncing that correctly. But anyway, these are the areas that affect language. So for example, after somebody's skydiving accident, doctors detected damage to the Broca's area. This would cause Carl to struggle to speak. And the Wernicke's area would cause difficulty for Carl to understand. Again, these are the areas of the brain that deal with language. Generally speaking, damage to different areas of the brain can cause different impacts in terms of the person's reaction. Damage to one area of the brain might affect sight. Damage to another area of the brain might affect hearing. Even though it doesn't specifically damage your eye or damage your ear, these are the parts of the brains that interpret or use these particular stimuli. And therefore, damage to different areas of the brain can cause problems that have nothing to do with, that have to do with other areas of the body. You wouldn't necessarily associate the brain with things like how your arm moves, but damage to part of the brain could cause a person not to be able to move his or her arm. Thinking and language is based on the theory of linguistic determinism, which is a hypothesis developed by Benjamin Lee Whorf, and that essentially says not something that's not so intuitive, and that is that language actually determines not only the way we speak, but the way we think. And we think about things for which we have no words. An example of a 1-year-old can tell the difference between a round cookie and a triangle pizza, even though he can't name them. You can distinguish them, but you can't, even if you can't actually understand what they are, or name them, or even think about what they are. This is actually a theory that postulates that language limits human knowledge and determines human knowledge and thought. Very interesting theory. It may not necessarily be true, but based on this theory, people actually think that maybe if you change language or increase or develop languages that are very efficient, you could actually make people smarter. Now, it wouldn't necessarily increase their raw brain computing power, but it may increase their abilities by making things more efficient. I mean, just to give you one example that I recently heard is that people very often, people of Asian descent, people in Chinese, Japanese people are very often considered better at math than people in the West, Americans and people in Western Europe. They theorize that part of the reason, and there may be many other reasons as well, but part of the reason is that the Chinese language has a much more descriptive way of saying things like fractions and numbers. We say 35, which is not so intuitive. Now, it's second nature to us, but a 3-year-old hears 35. There's no inherent reason why that should mean anything. Whereas the Asian languages may say it more like 3 tens and 5 instead of 35. Just things like that, where language can actually help and determine the ability of people to think and the ease with which people make mental connections. The next chapter is about intelligence. We all basically know what intelligence means, but from a psychological perspective, it takes on a slightly different meaning. Intelligence does not just mean, how well you can recite facts, how smart you are, but intelligence is designed and detailed a little bit more deeply than that. L.L. Thurstone, also, of course, an eminent practitioner, identified 7 clusters of primary mental abilities. Well, you got word fluency, how well you can speak, how well you can remember, how well you can put together words. Memory, well, we all know what memory is. Inductive reasoning, which is the type of reasoning by which you take evidence and try to draw conclusions from it. You see it's cold outside. You see there's snow on the ground. You see that there are no leaves on the trees, and therefore you determine that it is winter. That's an example of inductive reasoning. The opposite type is deductive reasoning, where you get the conclusion first, and then you assume facts based on that conclusion. Verbal comprehension, which is the ability to understand what people tell you. Numerical ability, essentially mathematics, the ability to perform math functions and interpretations. Perceptual speed, how fast you pick things up, how long it takes you to identify patterns, things like that, and spatial ability, which is the ability to mentally manipulate figures and objects to determine, to put together. Spatial ability is something that you use when you put together models, when you put together puzzles, things like that. And also, word fluency involves different dimensions of intelligence than that of reasoning. But the point is that all of these things are different types of mental abilities that goes to the sum total of a person's intelligence. And in terms of what intelligence is, there are really three types of intelligence. This analysis was developed by Robert J. Sternberg, an American psychologist who actually works for, I think he was born in New Jersey, but he works for Cornell University now. And the three types of intelligences that he categorized are analytical, which is really academic type of intelligence, book intelligence, book smarts, and the ability to problem solve, the ability to take aptitude tests, things like the SAT, LSAT, things like that, are tests of analytical intelligence. Not necessarily knowledge. Again, intelligence is different than knowledge. The amount of knowledge you have is, can help you on school tests, but aptitude tests like the SAT and IQ tests are things that measure analytical or problem-solving types of intelligence. This is assessed by intelligence tests like IQ tests, which present well-defined problems that have a particular right answer, like the SAT again. Such tests predict school grades relatively well. That's why when you want to get into college or law school or graduate school, they're going to ask you to take the GMATs or the GREs or the LSATs or the SATs because they want to see with reasonable predictive value how well you're going to do. Then there's creative intelligence. Again, something totally different than analytical intelligence is demonstrated in reacting adaptively to novel situations, creating activities for children on a rainy day. Teachers have to have a lot of creative intelligence, especially, or they should have a lot of creative intelligence in order to think a little bit outside the box and develop new solutions. It's very, very different from, book smarts, which is measured by analytical intelligence. And finally, you've got practical intelligence, which people may consider like street smarts. Book smarts versus street smarts. Analytical would be book smarts and practical would be street smarts. Creative, something in between, of course. Practical intelligence is required by everyday tasks, which are not well defined, and like managerial success. People who are managers may have to think and not necessarily have a book solution for every problem that goes on with their employees in terms of motivating them, in terms of disciplining them, whatever it is. They may have to think of practical solutions. For example, Lucy, who's established a large network of information sources for medical professionals, that would be an example of something, of developing that would be an example of practical intelligence rather than analytical or creative intelligence. The question then becomes, how do you test intelligence? How do you determine whether a person has intelligence or how much? Well, the answer is with a test. Now, a test doesn't necessarily mean a written test. We think of a test that you get graded on a scale of 0 to 100. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It could mean a practical exam, and it could be something that's not even established as a test. It could be a real-life scenario that somebody goes through, and you see how the person reacts to it. But in terms of general test construction, if you want to make a determination of who's intelligent in general, there are some standards that every test should meet. Number one, it should be standard. There should be standardization, which means you want to have an accurate comparison. If you give two different tests to two different people that have different levels of difficulty, well, then the results are not good in terms of comparing those two people. If you want to compare two people's analytical intelligence and you give them an analytical-based test, well, you have to make sure that the two tests have the same level of difficulty. Otherwise, comparing the two means nothing. Reliability. Does the test yield consistent results, or does it depend, if it's a practical thing, maybe it's if you're looking at how far somebody could throw a football, well, is it a windy day or is it a not windy day? Is it cold? Is it hot? Is the ball less inflated? Is the ball more inflated? Content validity is the extent to which a test samples the behavior that is interest. For example, if you're looking to see how well somebody is going to drive, the road test has validity because it actually puts them on the road. Now, it may not have a lot of reliability. It may not have a lot of validity because it may not put themselves in situations. You go to a road test and you're driving. You can go on a sunny day and they take you on streets where there's not much traffic. On the other hand, you put that same person on an icy day or in a day where there's a lot of traffic, it may yield different. Again, you can't. There's only a certain level of validity that you can actually achieve, but you want to achieve as much content validity as possible, which means that whatever you're testing, you want to make sure that whatever you're trying to determine, you want to make sure that whatever you're testing simulates as close as possible the real life scenario that you're trying to test. Now, the question, of course, is where do people get intelligence? Now, intelligence can be developed, can be nurtured, but it also can be inherited. And how, or the extent to which intelligence can be inherited is a very controversial and also a very interesting and very useful piece of information. Heritability is the word that is used to determine the proportion of variation among individuals that we can attribute to genes. We see people that are smarter, we see people that are not as smart. How much of that can we say, well, that person's parents were smart, that person's grandparents were smart, that person has really good genes, and how much is not based on heritability, which means it may be based on their environment, how much they developed their brain, how much they studied, etc. So the heritability of intelligence is the proportion of variation intelligence among individuals attributable to genetic variation. That's really the same thing as what is said up here. So that's an interesting question. The next issue is the issue of bias. The bias of intelligence may sound weird. How do intelligence seems like something that's inherent. It can't be subject to bias. But it's actually based on self-biased, almost, or self-fulfilling prophecy, a self-fulfilling concern, and that is a stereotype threat. People that consider themselves not smart are more likely to perform in a way that they're not smart, kind of like the placebo effect when you're talking about drugs. When completing a verbal aptitude tests, if for example, African American children are told that they scored worse, that they are likely to score worse on this particular test. When they actually take it, they may not have the same level of self-confidence, and they may actually perform worse. For many years, this was true regarding women in math. The theory was that girls were told that they weren't going to be as good as math as boys, and therefore they actually didn't perform as well at math as boys did. And again, that's the idea of selection bias, where because a person is stereotyped, they assume they're going to be bad at something, and so because of that, they perform at a lower level. They don't have quite the same level of self-confidence. Chapter 11 deals with emotion, stress, and health, kind of at the cross-section, at the crossroads between biological and psychological, is the idea of emotion and the effect of a person's emotions and the effect of the person's stress on a person's health. At first you may think, well, what does stress have to do with health? Stress is, emotional, psychological, whereas health is based on how your body performs. Well, how a person feels is both controlled by the person's brain and the person's emotion, and can be affected by a person. In other words, whether a person is stressed out can actually affect them in a physiological, not only psychological way. The Cannon-Bard theory is a theory that emotional expressions result from something that is in the brain. In this case, structures that are in the hypothalamus, basically that base of the brain that we looked at a little bit earlier. These things, these emotion-arousing stimuli, a person becomes very happy, a person becomes very sad, a person becomes very excited, that triggers physiological responses and the experience of emotion. In other words, it does both. You get something that you see something that you become very excited over for whatever reason. You have a physiological response. You also have an emotional response. The body's arousal, in other words, when you increase whatever adrenaline, neurological activity, whatever causes it, whatever stimulates it. It could be pretty much any kind of, you could become very happy about something, you could become very sad about something, you could become very excited about something, you could become very depressed about something. All of these things cause responses in the hypothalamus to cause the body to release more insulin, release more epinephrine, whatever. Anyway, to release more materials throughout the body that then turn around and stimulate the person's reactions. Botox is an interesting drug that just came out a few years ago that was designed to make people look younger, reduce the aging process. And it's based on the facial feedback effect. The idea is that people get wrinkles in their face because they frown a lot, because they have different emotions going through their face throughout the course of a lifetime, and eventually that causes the facial skin to become not smooth. So the facial feedback effect is the tendency of facial muscle to trigger corresponding feelings, such as fear, anger, or happiness. It's that when you feel sad and you frown, that then causes your emotions to change as well. Now, what Botox does is it paralyzes the frowning muscles. Now, I guess the main reason why it's sold is to decrease wrinkles in a person's face, because if you frown less, they're going to be fewer wrinkles. The wrinkles don't show as much. But on the other hand, it slows people reading of sadness-related sentences or sadness-related expressions, and it also slows activity in emotion-related brain circuits. So Botox, even though technically speaking, really the only thing it's affecting is the face itself, since the frowning itself can cause a reaction of the brain, it also can actually decrease unhappiness, which is a very interesting effect of Botox. Then we get to the stress response system. The stress response system is how our body deals with stress. Now, stress we all think of as being a bad thing, but stress can also be a good thing because it helps our body be much sharper as it reacts to things that cause high stress situations. The body's adaptive to stressors and is so general that it kicks in no matter how small the stressor. A stressor, which is something that increases the nervousness in your body, includes things like a burglar in the house, your house is on fire, you can't find your keys, and you need to be out of the house, trauma, any of these things, feeling very cold, feeling very hot, virtually anything could be considered a stressor that causes your body to react. You have some sort of a problem that causes your body to react. What does your body do? Well, the first thing is your sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is the one that gets you more active. The parasympathetic one is the one that calms you down. So the sympathetic nervous system is activated, which increases your heart rate, increases your blood flow to your skeletal muscles, which control your muscles, which control your movement, feelings of shock or faintness. Then resistance, where the body kind of stays on high alert. And then exhaustion. You become more vulnerable to illness or even death in cases where a person has been under stress for a long period of time. Essentially what happens is, when something stressful happens, the body says, okay, we need more energy. You know, when somebody has to lift a car off their, you hear stories where mothers were able to lift cars off their children who were trapped in these cars. What happened in that kind of case is that the body said, oh boy, this is a really stressful situation, and the body diverted a tremendous amount of energy, tremendous amount of blood flow, adrenaline, to the skeletal muscles. Now, if this happens temporarily, that's fine, but if a person is under high stress for a long period of time, obviously that's not good because the body wasn't meant to react at that level for a long period of time. So, what do you do about stress? If a person's under a lot of stress for a long period of time, that could cause problems. So, you can try to cope, first of all, which is alleviating stress using emotional, cognitive, or behavioral methods. There could be various ways to just decrease stress by not thinking about it, taking your mind off of it. And, there are whole studies, obviously, on how to decrease stress in a person's life. One of the things we faced in today's day and age, even though we have tremendous technological comforts compared to many years ago, our jobs and our lives are higher stress very often than they used to be. There could be problem-focused coping, where you're trying to cope with the problem itself. You're trying to alleviate the stress directly by changing the stressor. Just have less stress. And if you lose a job, enroll in a full-time retraining program to take your mind off of it. You're not worried so much if you're getting retraining. Maybe you're not as worried about not having a job. Then there's emotion-focused coping, which is to alleviate stress by avoiding or ignoring it, really taking your mind off it. The first one isn't taking your mind off of it. The first one is fixing it. Whatever the problem was, take care of the problem. If there's no longer a problem, well, then you're no longer going to be under stress about it. Emotion-focused coping is taking your mind off of it. You seek social support, do other things. These are different ways of coping with stress. Other ways of coping with stress include aerobic exercise. Jogging, swimming, biking can help increase fitness, and the more efficient your heart beating is, the easier it is for the body to cope with the increased stress, the increased activity levels that come from stress. And another way to deal with stress is relaxing. Meditation. Relaxing is relaxing your muscles, lying around, in a hot tub, whatever it is. Slowing down your breathing, slowing down your heart rate, decreasing blood pressure. Using techniques to do these things decreases the effect of stress, because remember, stress speeds up your heart rate, speeds up your blood pressure. If you can try to reduce these things, you're combating the effect. And of course, relaxation response in association with meditation, which is sitting quietly in a comfortable position, relaxing your muscles, closing your eyes, etc. And interestingly enough, the faith factor has actually been shown to apply to stress as well. Religiously active people tend to live longer than those who are not religiously active. And again, the reason for that is, I guess they're able to cope with stress better, having a more of a big picture way of looking at things than people who don't have those same factors. Next, we move on to personality, which is where this course gets a little more complex as we kind of wind it down. Remember, this is still an introductory course. Personality, however, is not an introductory issue. It's quite a complex issue, and we'll discuss it in, brief detail, not too much detail. That'll be left for more advanced courses. Okay, so first of all, you have to realize that a lot of this stuff is very controversial, and a lot of personality work was done by Sigmund Freud, and a lot of his work has been questioned or discredited. So a lot of this is conjecture, theory, and there's not that much mathematical certainty as there was when we looked at the chapter on the brain and the nervous system. So, according to Freud, the process by which children incorporate their parents' values into developing their superegos, which is essentially the sum total of their personality, is called identification. They identify with their parents' values and with their parents' words, and that's how they help develop or incorporate that into their egos, into their superego, ego. Well, let's back up for a second. Basically, under Freudian theory, and again, this is not really so necessary for the course, but still it's good for background. Freud kind of divided the human personality into three sections. You have the id, you have the ego, and the superego. The id is really your instincts. Well, not really based on your personality, what you start with as a baby and kind of take forward into life. Then you have your superego, which looks at the id and kind of determines what elements are good and what elements are not good, kind of the moral part of the personality. The id is the instinct, what you want to do, and the superego kind of decides what the moral or correct or proper thing to do is. And when you combine them, you have the ego. The ego is kind of the thing that makes the ultimate decision. Based on the right thing to do suggestion of the superego and the instinctual suggestion of the id, and whatever you actually do, that's really kind of your ego, which is more like an overall general term. Again, it sounds kind of silly sometimes, but that's just different ways of looking at the different thought processes by which people make their decisions. Fixation, according to in Freudian theory, is a focus on pleasure-seeking energies. For example, The last example is probably a better example. Dana had orally overindulged, in other words, she'd eaten a lot or whatever, and she may fixate on an oral stage. She could, there was, it's hard to really describe these things without going into too much detail. But essentially, fixation is when some sort of experience that the person has had causes them to overly focus on a particular aspect as they get older. Then you have the concept of self-actualization. Self-actualization as a theory was developed by, again, another, obviously a psychologist, Abraham Maslow, also in the mid-1900s, when Freud was actually in the 1800s, but most of the works that we've seen so far in this course have been developed in the 1900s. And the idea of self-actualization is the motivation to fulfill one's potential. The idea of the person's motivation, the person's goal, the person generally, whatever that potential is. A person might want to be a great athlete, or might want to be a great thinker, or might want to be a great moneymaker, business person, parent, whatever. The person's internal motivation to seek excellence in whatever that person wants to do with his or her life is this theory of self-actualization. And according to Maslow, one of the ultimate psychological needs is this idea of self-actualization. In other words, once your basic needs have been met, you have food, you have shelter, you have clothing, whatever it is, the next thing is you want to try to actualize. You want to try to do whatever your personal goals are. And that's your self-esteem is dependent on at least taking steps towards this actualization, this self-actualization. Trait theory, on the other hand, again, it's not a contradiction with anything we've discussed before, but trait theory focuses on defining and describing personality. Trait is a pattern, a characteristic. Now, a physical trait could be brown eyes or blonde hair. A personality trait, on the other hand, of course, is a characteristic pattern of behavior. Or a person that gets very emotional, a person that gets very sad, a person that gets very excited, a person that gets very afraid. All these things would be considered a personality trait. All of these different things: identification, fixation, self-actualization, inherent traits. These are all things that go towards developing a personality in a person. And that leads us, in determining personality, to another dichotomy. Remember, earlier in the course we discussed the dichotomy between nature and nurture. A person's inherent skills, a person's inherent characteristics, and those that are developed by the social surrounding. Well, when it comes to personality, we have again a similar dichotomy between the person and the situation. The person-situation controversy is the debate regarding the influence of the environment and traits. Which one affects the person's personality? Now, obviously, the answer, of course, is both. Your situation and who you deal with and what your experiences are one element, and another element of what your inherent traits are. What your inherent personal traits are. If you're a very emotional person, but you're in a situation where there's just not you work as an actuary or you work as an accountant or something, you're just not going to get that worked up at work because there's just not that much to be emotional about. On the other hand, if you're very stoic and but you work in a situation where you're dealing with in an emergency room, it obviously could cause your emotional element to become more developed as well. So we look for genuine personality traits that persist over time and across situations. In other words, one thing to look at whether something is based on traits or based on the environment, we have to look at, is there a type of trait that always applies? For example, if a person always tends to be calm, well, and that applies to even very, very stressful, very harrowing situations, we can look at that as a trait rather than something that's dictated by the environment. And people's behaviors are more strongly influenced by temporarily external influence than by enduring inner influences. That's a behavior. That's the difference between a trait and a behavior. A behavior, just an act, is based on temporary situations. Traits, stable and potent. Behaviors, on the other hand, things that cause people to act on the spur of the moment, are less consistent. And that's why personality tests are not such good predictors of behaviors. Just because somebody's personality is calm doesn't necessarily mean that the person will remain calm under very stressful situations. And of course, the immediate situation has a powerful influence on a person's behavior, and traits can be overcome, in some cases, by social pressures that cause behaviors. So you have these traits on the one side which are more natural, behaviors on the other side which are more situation-based. Both of them, of course, have an impact on somebody's personality and on somebody's social interaction. A couple of examples, or one example really over here. Clara actively participates in many class discussion, but seems reluctant to talk with friends at the campus coffee shop. She's animated and talkative when she's her close friends, but she's quiet and reserved at home. She may have a trait that causes her to be quiet, but when she's in a social situation, her behavior adjusts, for the social appropriateness of where she is. Even though she's generally quiet and tends to be quiet at home, when she's in class, she feels the need to add to the class discussion, and when she's with her close friends, because of her social situation, it's not as intimidating. Her trait of being quiet doesn't show as much, and her behavior is able to be a little bit different. Anxiety. Okay, that's the next concept. Now, anxiety is a little bit different than stress. Whereas stress is an individual situation that causes the adrenaline and the blood to flow more, anxiety is a little deeper. Anxiety is sometimes defined as a state of inner turmoil, accompanied by nervous behavior. You're worried about something. It's not an issue of stress necessarily, although people very often do confuse stress and anxiety. Stress is, you see a car coming at you, and you got to decide what to do. Your body, you're really paying attention. Your body is focusing on the problem at hand and what to do about it. Anxiety, on the other hand, you're worried that your plane is going to crash. You're worried that your company is going to close. You're worried that your friends are not going to like you anymore. Whatever it is, you're worried that your children aren't going to come out well. Anxiety, really, according to Freud at least, is the price we pay for civilization. We have a structure that we establish, and then we worry that the structure that has been established for us may come falling apart. And according to Freud, we're anxious about our unacceptable wishes and impulses, and we repress this anxiety. Sometimes we want to do things that we can't, and that turns into an anxiety. There's another element, humanistic psychology, that looks at anxiety a little bit different, focuses more on healthy, creative people, and looking at the environmental factors. And the idea is, we're under Freud's rules, anxiety is kind of, there's no way to stop it. There's no way to, it's just a fact of life. There are other strains of thought that say that anxiety can be treated with therapy. Here are some examples of how you would go against or how you would deal with anxiety, according to Freud. Again, not necessarily are all of these healthy. Regression would be a defense mechanism. Again, these are all things that may not necessarily be a good idea. Treatment might try to get the person to deal with things differently. And regression means retreating to a more infantile stage where some psychic energy remains fixated. Again, dealing with anxiety might be to not deal with it, and not dealing with it you might regress to a stage where you're not responsible for that. If you're worried about not being able to pay your mortgage, your personality could regress to, one way of dealing with that is to regress to the point where you're not an adult responsible for a mortgage. One example is a little boy reverts to oral comfort of sucking his thumb while on the way to his first day of school. He's anxious about his first day of school, so he deals with that by internally regressing to a point where he's not old enough to go to school. Reaction formation, switching unacceptable impulses to their opposites. A person, instead of feeling angry, instead pretends or covers it with a mask of extreme friendliness and niceness. Projection. That's an interesting one. Projection, people are anxious about their own acts, so they project it on somebody else and at least convince themselves that somebody else is the one with the problem. The thief thinks everyone else is a thief. That's an El Salvadorian saying, based on the idea that you say, well, I'm doing something wrong. Well, everybody else is probably doing it too. Rationalization. Another kind of way of people deal with anxiety about their own behaviors, but they rationalize it. A habitual drinker says, it's okay. I'm not really drinking very much. I'm not drunk. I'm just drinking social. Displacement is shifting aggressive impulses towards a more acceptable or less threatening object or person. This is actually something that might help. So, some of these are good, some of these are bad, some of these, all of these probably have their place and can be good in some ways and bad in others. A little girl kicks the family dog after her mother sends her to her room. Basically, she's taking her aggression out on somebody else. Again, that could be bad when you're taking it out on your dog, or it could be good when you're taking it out on your punching bag, or you're taking it out on your pillow. That could be okay. Denial is, of course, refusing to believe even painful realities. I think we all understand what that is. We've seen people in denial. Maybe we've been in denial every once in a while. That's just a way of life. People do deny things because the realities are painful and they just can't deal with them for whatever reason. Now, here are a bunch of personality theories. Again, I told you before that this is very much an inexact science. But here are some theories of personalities. And again, these are not all mutually exclusive. Some of them could be true and others could also be true. The psychoanalytic theory, which is Freud's, probably has the most assumptions, in that emotional disorders spring from unconscious dynamics, unresolved childhood conflicts, fixations, all the things that we already discussed. And of course, Freud's other idea was that the personality is divided into three areas: the id, which is the impulse; the reality-oriented executive, which is the ego, and which is the combination of the superego and the id. The id was the internalized set of ideals, in other words, the moral arbiter, and the ego was like the combination. And the personality assessment methods, these are just different ways that you can assess a personality: dream analysis, different types of psychoanalysis. There's the psychodynamic personality, which is the idea that the unconscious and conscious minds interact. And again, you can see some of these. We already discussed the humanistic one. We already discussed traits. And social cognitive is the idea that our traits and social context interact with each other. Now, the thing is, what I think is important is to know, not necessarily to memorize all of these different things and what this chart says and how it works, but just to know what these are. A trait is an ingrained personality feature, whereas the humanistic approach applies more to try to resolve conflicts. And once, so the self-actualization issue, where we can take care of our personality problems by therapy and by trying to achieve self-actualization. Then there's the social cognitive perspective, which places a greater emphasis on social, which is our social interaction with other people, which views behavior as influenced by the interactions between people's traits, different people, and it emphasizes the interaction of our traits with our situation. Again, that's not a contradiction necessarily to anything we've looked at before, but it's putting more of an emphasis on the interaction between what our inherent desires or our inherent tendencies are and the social situation. Chapter 14 deals with social psychology. This is where we're going to look into the elements of psychology that are influenced by the social surrounding of the individual. The first thing I want to discuss is the attribution error. The attribution error means where somebody sees a result and assumes that something is causing it, where that may be a mistake. That's why it's called an error. So it's a tendency for observers, when analyzing another's behavior, to underestimate the impact of the situation or to overestimate the impact of a personal disposition. The example here is where a student does poorly on a test and the teacher, or the parent in some cases, assumes that it's because the child was unmotivated, the child didn't study properly, whatever it is. Well, that may be the case, but it may very well not be the case. It may be because the child was sick. It may be because the child has some sort of a learning disability that prevents him from being able to do well in that particular test. It may be because of bad luck. The child made some assumptions that turned out to be not true.
there could be many different reasons why things happened, and people attribute actions to personalities a little bit too quickly sometimes. That's an attribution error, to assume that something is a result of something else without accounting for the possibility that there's something else that caused the particular result. For example, a wide economic gulf between a country's rich and poor is likely to be associated with high crime rates. People assume that that's the reason why people are poor is because they're criminal, or because they don't study, or because they don't focus on education. But there may be other aspects. There may be other reasons for this kind of phenomenon. Another important concept in social psychology is the concept of conformity. Conformity is the general concept of adjusting behavior to coincide with the standard of a group. So people as people are social animals. People look to the behavior of others and seek the approval of others when they're behaving in their general behavior, and that's the idea of conformity. Here's an example. I mean, this is an extreme example, but there are many other examples that we see on a day-to-day basis. The board members are voting whether to begin a campaign to build a new updated school building. Mr. Roebuck doesn't like the plan, but he votes for it anyway because everybody else votes for it. Everybody else thinks it's a good idea, so even though you don't think it's a good idea, you just go ahead and conform. It's, group mentality, mob mentality, so to speak. It could be a bad thing because it takes away people's individuality of thought. So conformity is another aspect of social psychology that people need to be aware of. Then there's de-individuation, or social relations. This is even more. This is like conformity taken to the next level. This is where it can become dangerous. This is where people lose self-awareness and self-restraint in group situations that foster arousal or anonymity. When New York University women dressed as in KKK-style hoods, they demonstrated significantly more aggression, and during riots and looting, rioters were disinhibited by social arousal. The idea here really is that when people join the mob, they lose their inhibition. What they would never do on their own, they do because they're part of the mob, and everybody's doing it. And besides, especially if people are wearing masks and nobody can tell who they are, well, they don't have to risk social disapproval. They don't have to risk getting in trouble because they've got masks on. Also, if they're part of a group, they figure that the whole group isn't going to get in trouble. It's like, in a classroom you see that sometimes, where people, individuals wouldn't make trouble, but if everybody's making trouble, so they figure they have nothing to lose, they figure that, the whole class is not going to get in trouble, they can't get us all in trouble, you hear sometimes. That's, it's mob mentality. It's the idea of, a group ignoring what their conscience would tell them on an individual level. Other aspects in terms of social relations, other social psychology things to be aware of: prejudice. Prejudice is an unjustified attitude towards a group of people, usually a race or a religion, or any group of people. Having prejudice is assuming something bad about an individual because they belong to a particular group, and behavior based on prejudice, behavior against a person because that person is a member of a group of a religion or a race or an ethnic group, that is discrimination. That's unjustified behavior selectively applied towards members of a group. And then something similar is a stereotype. Stereotype doesn't necessarily mean any behavior, but a stereotype means you make an assumption. You see somebody who's a particular ethnic group and you figure, oh, that person must be a criminal, or oh, that person, or even it could even not necessarily be a bad thing. It could be, oh, that person must be smart because that person is, that person must be good at math because she's Asian, or whatever it is. It's also a stereotype. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad to be considered a stereotype. Now, stereotypes aren't usually true aren't necessarily true because, of course, people are individuals and you can't group people together like that. A couple of other things regarding social psychology is norms for helping. Social exchange theory is the theory that our social behavior is an exchange process to maximize the benefits to everybody and to minimize the costs to minimize the costs to everybody. The idea is you help me, I help you. That's the way we work as a society. We try to help each other in order to make to have us all benefit from society. And social responsibility norm is when there's an expectation. Of course, that's a wonderful thing when there's an expectation that people will help people who are dependent on them. For example, there was a story a couple of years ago when a man fell into a New York subway tracks. A man by the name of Wesley Autry risked his life to save the man. He ran onto the subway tracks in order to push him out of the way. In order to get him out of the way, he risked his own life based on this idea that there's an expectation, even though he wasn't required to help him, there's an expectation, or at least a moral responsibility, that people have to try to help each other when they're in dangerous situations. And our final chapter in this course is on psychological disorders. Problems, diseases, that affect people's minds, that affect people's thoughts, that affect people's personalities. First thing is that there is actually an authoritative scheme for classifying psychological disorders, the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, whatever it is. And that obviously is a very useful thing for practitioners that are looking to diagnose people. But on the other hand, it also could cause some problems, and there are some criticisms. First of all, they can be value judgments masquerading as science, and the idea is that people are individuals. Labeling someone, this person is schizophrenic, and this person is sociopathic, and this person is this, and this person is that, kind of takes away from personal responsibility a little bit. David Rosenham and his fellow researchers and were admitted to various patients. Basically, what they did was essentially is they did a study to see whether labels would affect people, and they realized that labels affected the doctor. If the doctor was told to diagnose or label an individual, the doctor was more likely to diagnose the person than in other scenarios where the doctor would just say the person is basically normal but just needs to correct this particular incident. So the point is that labeling psychological disorders is controversial. That being said, we're going to spend the next few minutes looking at various labels of psychological disorders. Just keep in mind that there is some controversy there for that reason, that it tends to, sometimes saying somebody is sociopathic, maybe making a value judgment about that person when maybe all you really needed to say is that person did a bad thing. People who are insane sometimes get away with or are found not guilty of crimes based on that. Okay, so let's take a look at some psychological disorders. First of all, you've got panic disorder. Panic disorder is kind of like anxiety on steroids. Remember, there was stress, which was normal and happens to everybody. When it causes your brain to focus and be a little sharper for a little while. It could be a good thing even in certain circumstances. Then there was anxiety, which was more longer-term fare. And then you've got panic. Panic is where people's anxiety gets the better of them and is marked by unpredictable, minutes-long episodes of intense dread. These include things like terror and chest pains, choking sensation, shortness of breath, trembling or dizziness, heart palpitations, all things that actually simulate similar symptoms to heart attacks and things like that, which obviously just feeds the panic and makes them even more nervous and makes them even more worried. So panic disorder is one aspect. Depression is our second disease that we're going to look at. Women are a little bit more vulnerable than men, but again, things that depression, which is a long-term idea of being sad for no real specific reason, just in general. Factors that put people at risk include genetic predisposition. People who have depression in their families are more likely to be depressed. Child abuse. When the person gets older, more likely to be depressed. Low self-esteem, marital problems, and even women sometimes are even more susceptible than men to this because of learned helplessness is more common in women. The idea that women don't control their own destiny is more ingrained in our culture. Women tend to overthink things sometimes and blame themselves more than men, who just kind of, don't worry about things that are going wrong. And women are more likely to have self-defeating beliefs and negative explanatory style. And really it's also about being a little bit more emotional. So again, both genders are definitely susceptible to depression, although women a little bit more than men. Here are some examples of the style, the depressed explanatory style, how people explain their failures in terms of
depression and in terms of a healthy response. This column over here is the depression column, which is the bad column, hopefully, and then you've got the this column is the more healthy idea that the problem is temporary. A person loses a job, for example, a stable person, the healthy way to look at it would look at it as temporary, as in it's hard to take, but I'll get through it. A person that's suffering from depression, or that's likely to suffer from depression, might say, I'll never get over this. And then you look at specific as opposed to global. Specific is you're looking at it as one individual problem. I'll miss my job, but I've got other things that are important in my life. Whereas somebody who has depression might say, I don't have anything productive to do. This is a huge issue. This is a bigger issue. This is a global issue. External. Somebody who's healthy looks at it not necessarily as a problem in the person, but a problem in the circumstance. Not every person is right for every job, whereas an internal position might be a person who internalizes it and is depressed might say being fired was my fault, which obviously is not an inherent, or it's the sort of thing that could cause problems when it comes to depression. Next, we're going to look at bipolar disorder, which is kind of a disorder where people swing between two poles. That's why it's called bipolar, where people at one point are very excitable and very energetic, very up, let's say, so to speak, and the other times person is very depressed, very down. They used to call this manic depressive because the person was sometimes depressed and sometimes manic, which is just very, very, very energetic. But this is a mood disorder which a person alternates between hopelessness and lethargy, that's the down, and overexcited state of mania. Mania means a mood disorder sparked by hyperactive, wildly optimistic state. Very, very energetic. People that are manic depressive, people that are bipolar, when they're in their manic state, they can be very productive and very efficient. When they're in their down state, on the other hand, it's much more difficult. For example, depression is, of course, as we discussed before, a mood disorder in which a person experiences, in the absence of drug or other medical condition, 2 or more weeks of significant depressed moods. That's how you define depression, as opposed to just being in a bad mood. Being in a bad mood doesn't mean you're depressed, but 2 or more weeks of significantly depressed moods and diminished interest in pleasure activities is a symptom of depression. Example, within 3 months, George wrote 20 musical compositions. That's his manic state. And then the next 6 months, he didn't write a single one. And then in the following 5 months, he wrote another 55. Again, this is symptom. It doesn't inherently mean maybe George was just being lazy or on vacation, but it's an inherent that George could be suffering over here from bipolar disorder. During the manic phase, during the high phase of bipolar disorder, the person is overtalkative, overactive, elated, which means very happy but very easily irritated, has little need for sleep, loud, flighty, hard to interrupt speech, lacks good judgment, again, very energetic, flying all over the place, off the handle. On the other hand, during the depressed phase, it's the opposite. Depressed mood for most of the day, insomnia or too much sleep, fatigue, inappropriate feelings of guilt or worthlessness, even thoughts of death or suicide, and along with problems in thinking and concentration. Those are symptoms of bipolar disorder. Our next disorder is antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is somebody who, due to psychological illness, has an antisocial personality, which means that he or she cannot get along with people. That's antisocial. A personality disorder in which a person, usually a man, and depression was suffered more by women, but antisocial personality is suffered more by men, exhibits a lack of conscience for wrongdoing, even towards friends or family members. The person may very often, people become criminals, they do things that are immoral because they simply don't have the understanding or they don't have the ability to conform themselves to what's socially expected of them. They may be aggressive or ruthless or a con artist, again, because they don't have those same social constraints that most of us have. They behave impulsively and then feel and fear little. That doesn't bother them. They're not afraid of it. They also could be known as a sociopath or a psychopath. Those are different words that you have for this same basic idea, where a person simply just doesn't have the same feelings of conscience and the same feelings of remorse that other people do. So, for example, a person that's suffering from an antisocial personality disorder may be unable to hold a steady job, may be an irresponsible parent, lying, stealing, ruthless, etc. All obviously very, very negative traits, as you can imagine. And finally, we have eating disorders. Now, these aren't the only eating disorders there are, but certainly these are very common ones. One of them is anorexia nervosa. Anorexia is really just a compulsion to lose weight. Sometimes people want to, even though they're already skinny, they want to keep losing weight. It could be very, very dangerous, of course. Example, somebody who was a little overweight but then went ahead and lost 65 pounds and then continues to want to lose weight. Even though the person's already very light, the person still wants to lose more weight. That's a symbol of anorexia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa is a compulsion to binge and then losing the food through vomiting, laxative, or extreme exercises. People who eat but then try to throw it up, or people who eat and then try to get it out of their system using laxatives, very strong exercise, etc. That's also an eating disorder. And then you've got binge eating disorder, people who just simply go and eat too much. Now again, just because somebody eats too much doesn't mean that they have a binge eating disorder. I mean, a lot of us eat too much, unfortunately. But a compulsion to just eat like a crazy amount and then have a cycle of feeling guilty and depressed about it, that could be a binge eating disorder. And that's all we have for this course. So thank you very much for listening. Good luck on the exam, and have a great day, everybody.